Hey, everybody. Welcome to CISA Live. We are back again a little bit sooner than usual, which I am super psyched about, because we are here today to talk with some CISA famous experts about open source software security. So, who wants to dive into this topic? I'm excited because I am being joined today by Ava Black, the open source security section chief, and Jack Cable, CISA senior technical advisor, who just happened to be here in person. And so here we are. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Aaron. We're super excited to talk about some of the work we're doing at CISA on open source software security. We just got out of our first summit we held with the open source software community on this topic and have a number of exciting areas we're working towards and really pushing to help secure this global ecosystem we all rely on.
That's fantastic. And we're gonna really get into that. But before we get started, because I did say that you were both CISA famous. Tell us, what would you say you do here?
Well, I joined only about 8 months ago, coming from a career in open source software and security work for more than 20 years. So bringing that knowledge in, bringing in my community connections, and helping to really rally our efforts to support open source software security.
Awesome.
I've been at CISA slightly longer than Ava, about a year now, come from a background in security research and software development. And through my time, got into security through a bug bounty program, started to see some of the common trends in relatively simple flaws that led to quite dangerous vulnerabilities in software. So eventually that led me to CISA to help lead our work around both open source software security and secure by design, where we're really trying to make sure that software manufacturers act responsibly by building security into their products from the start.
But this is not your first time at CISA.
I was at CISA in 2020 working on election security, and glad to be back.
Well, we are thrilled to have both of you on the team. We could not do it without you. But before we talk about the open source summit that both of you just hosted, congrats. I know that's quite a lift. Let's talk about what open source is and why it matters.
Sure, I'll jump on this one. Open source software is software under a license that allows anyone to access, modify, and redistribute and study the source code behind it. And that sort of grew out of efforts from the late 80s, early 90s, early computing days, and a set of software licenses that are sort of codified under a nonprofit foundation called the Open Source Initiative. They sort of normalize what those licenses are. But from that legal basis, so much innovation has grown. It's really powered a tremendous amount of innovation globally over the past 30-ish years. And it's now sort of the underpinning of most modern technology.
Just to give a sense of the scale we're talking about here, a recent Harvard study found that open source software has generated over $8 trillion in value, compared to just about $4 billion it's cost to produce this. So our critical infrastructure, our federal government, the entire world really has gotten so much value from this critical public good. And we want to ensure at CISA that this ecosystem that we all rely upon and get so much value from is secure and that we can continue to get its benefits.
And one of my favorite little elements of that Harvard study, citing about $8 trillion per year of economic value, it actually left out the biggest part of open source operating systems. They're too valuable to even estimate the value they bring.
And how secure is open source software today?
The sort of community adage a long time ago was more eyeballs, more people looking at it, makes it more secure. And that is still largely true of most open source projects, particularly those that are stewarded by foundations. And these are typically the largest projects that everyone depends on. Lots of people review it. They're under active scrutiny from the public, from groups like CISA, in the European Union, all over the world, collaborating on them. However, a lot of open source projects are also just developed by one person with no code review. And so those are going to be a little bit higher risk.
It sounds like definitely a community effort. What is the government's role in open source software security? How do you see us being a part of this.
Yep, and in some ways, government has been late to the game when it comes to the open source community overall. Again, this has been occurring for decades. There have been some government involvement, but we would argue not enough, and that's why we're really looking to ensure that we are doing our part to help secure this community. Many people might be familiar with the Log4Shell vulnerabilities in the Log4j library that came out in 2021 that were a wake-up call to many. That the security of open source software is of critical importance, but it was something that many in the open source community have known for decades. So we view our role as not to control or regulate open source software or its production, but really to help show up as a community member, because we recognize, one, the federal government is one of the largest users of open source software in the world. Just as any private company should do, we need to contribute back, do our part to help sustain this community we get so much value from. And two, given our responsibilities at CISA to help protect not just the federal government, but critical infrastructure, it's of really the utmost importance that we help ensure that we all can continue to get these values in a secure manner.
Alternatively, I think that's great. CISA does really work to bring together all facets, to collaborate on security. What do you think the software developers' role is in open source software security?
And maybe I'll start by breaking that down into two groups. There's the volunteer open source developers, there's the nonprofit foundations who are resource constrained and doing a tremendous public service by maintaining these critical libraries that everyone around the globe relies upon. Your computer, your phone have tons of open source software that are maintained by a relatively small group of often volunteers. There's companies and others as well who participate in this, but there's that aspect. And then really where we're trying to emphasize, in line with our secure by design work at CISA, where we're encouraging all software manufacturers to build their technology in a way that's secure from the start and secure out of the box. We want to make sure that every software manufacturer who's getting so much value from the open source software they're using and packaging up to their customers, because they don't have to rewrite everything from scratch each time, that they're doing what it takes to help ensure that the software they rely upon is secure, whether through financial contributions back to those open source developers, whether through the time of their own employees to help sustain this ecosystem.
And building on that, something that I saw for decades working in the private sector as a maintainer of some large open source projects, that sort of balance between the employer benefiting from the project while also often either withholding features that would help with security or just withholding their employees' time. So the employee who is in their day job using the software is still only as a volunteer keeping it safe and secure and fixing bugs. And we'd like to see more companies that are benefiting from open source actually empower their employees to go maintain it and keep it secure and work upstream to keep the commons secure.
So that seems like a big push, a big effort. And you're in town because you were hosting the Open Source Software Security Summit. How did it go? Tell us a little bit about it. What were we working to accomplish? And how did it go?
It went incredibly well. There have been a couple events like this before, but none hosted by CISA. And so we brought together a number of different foundations and companies that are deep supporters of open source. So Jack mentioned earlier some nonprofits and charities. There's also companies who operate components in the open source infrastructure. The event really focused on one piece of that ecosystem, the package repositories. And that's how developers, after they've built an open source component, share it. And these are platforms for sharing those components to other folks, whether they're other open source projects or companies that benefit from them. And so we focused on that aspect of the community, brought together about 40 people. First day was a bunch of talks and small workshop groups. And then the second day, we held a tabletop exercise. I think that's the first time that this has ever been done, to explore a sort of worst case scenario, taking actual examples of major incidents that have occurred, mostly through open source, not because of open source, but where there was a flaw that someone found, like Log4Shell or Heartbleed a decade ago, things like that. And we put them together into a sort of a worst case. What happens if A and B and C all fail? How do these critical components of the supply chain respond? How do they rally together? What resources can we offer them? What do they need to recover from something that bad?
By the way, we'll be publishing those materials so anyone can do the same exercise and explore how this applies to their communities.
That sounds amazing and frightening. I think
a little bit, yeah.
But that's the point of that conversation, right? To, take it apart before it actually happens and figure out sort of what we do. Is there anything coming out of these 2 days? Is there anything that you didn't know 2 days ago?
I think there were a lot of lessons learned, not just for us, but we heard from many of the attendees that just getting everyone from all these communities, even though they're part of this global open source community, they might not kind of interact with everyone who's there in their day-to-day work. So they found tremendous value in being able to kind of talk with people from different communities, say different package repositories, talking to each other to really understand how they operate in their own space. And just to give kind of one example of the work we're doing here, a couple of weeks ago, we published a document with one of the community working groups around securing package repositories. And for those unfamiliar, package repositories are the place where pretty much any software developer in the world goes to download open source software. So these repositories themselves are often run by resource-constrained organizations, but they're fulfilling this really global infrastructure role by hosting software that's used by basically every company, every organization across the world. So we really want to see how we can work with these organizations hosting these platforms, many nonprofits, to drive some of these critical security improvements. We put out a document laying out best practices for security here. And as part of the summit today, we actually announced actions that 5 of the top package repositories are taking to further help secure their package systems. There's a lot of great work that's been done, but we want to continue working with this community to drive it even further.
So those are the big announcements. That's amazing. But this is not the open source summit was not the first effort. CISA has been working on this for a while. What else, have we done leading up to this?
We've been quite active in the space. We, in September, published our open source software security roadmap, which really lays out how CISA intends to work to drive forward security, both for the federal government's use of open source software, but then also for the broader open source ecosystem over the next few years. So I'll touch on maybe a few areas and let Ava cover a few too. But a lot of this work really has been focused on, one, building up our relationships with the open source community. Again, it's an area where we traditionally haven't worked as much, and given the critical role that open source software plays and will only continue to grow, we view it as essential to build relationships such as through the summit. We also announced an effort to really build out collaboration channels for real-time information sharing with open source community members, particularly package repositories, to help protect against emerging threats. So that's one area where we're really driving forward, but our goal is to work with federal partners and the open source community to have a long-term enduring responsibility of the federal government to drive this forward.
And as Jack mentioned, our approach to this is supportive. We want to offer services that we uniquely can provide when those communities need them and not before, not imposing our desires or any regular action, just offering help. And many of the attendees didn't know CISA's role with respect to other critical infrastructure, and that we can offer some of the same things to them. So we even had a couple of folks coming out of the summit saying, wow, this was fantastic. I'd like you to come teach our community these same things.
That's, as an external affairs person, that just makes me smile. That's terrific. So what's next? What does the future look like? There's been so much work done. You're coming out of this amazing collaborative discussion. What's on the horizon?
First things first, we got to digest the feedback and all the notes and all the conversations. There's going to be a bunch of follow-up emails and chats with the different foundations, the different package repositories to figure out some of the next steps. I'm sure they're also all digesting the discussions they had amongst each other the last 2 days. We have a couple of speaking engagements coming up on these topics at events hosted by those foundations. Right? They came to our event, we go to their events, and much more work to be done on our roadmap as well.
Yep, really, as Ava mentioned, again, our core goal here is to be a value add to the open source community, really a force multiplier to these existing efforts. So we're going to, for instance, be continuing to push forward on package repository security, working with the community working groups to drive this forward. And we're really eager to see, again, emphasizing the secure by design nature, how we think we can be doing our part here at CISA, but we want to encourage every company out there that's benefiting from this to really think hard about what their role is and to consider, whether it's through financial or employee time contributions, how they can be a community member too and help sustain this global public good.
That sounds like a lot of work, but really important work. It's hard to sort of grasp just how important and foundational open source software is, and that is, basically secured by volunteers. That is just really fantastic and a little bit mind-blowing, based on just kind of how much rides on this. Okay, so are you both ready for audience questions?
Let's hear it.
Okay. How do you balance the need for transparency and collaboration in open source development with security requirements?
So open source communities, I mentioned earlier, some projects are just 1 or 2 people, and some projects are thousands of people collaborating, generally in the open, on an open platform. And even though the development is and should be mostly public, the security teams of these large projects often have a private channel, both for the submission of vulnerability reports. They're handled incredibly sensitively, just like they would be at a company. And the volunteers work together to maybe work with the researcher, address the vulnerability, prepare a patch, and ideally also notify some of the downstream consumers of that project to get ready for a fixed rollout. It's a very similar process to what happens at any company that's handling vulnerability reports responsibly.
Yep, and just to emphasize there that really we view both with open source software, but even security more generally, one of our core principles of secure by design is that of radical transparency. We want every company to be talking openly about what doesn't work. Likewise, this is a core value of the open source community already, and that's something we're looking to follow with our work. So the principles for package repository security document I mentioned, that was developed openly with an open working group. Anyone can join. We're going to be putting out the materials from our tabletop exercise out to the world. Anyone can use, adapt from that. So really, we want to emphasize that in our work around open source community, that we're working under the existing ways that these communities work.
I think that the transparency point is very important, because I think that there sometimes is this, kind of not wanting to share about, vulnerability or, what kind of vulnerability it is. But, to the secure by design point, when that level of transparency is shared, everybody has a better idea of what to look for, whether they're in one sector or not. And I think that that's an excellent point in terms of just kind of like raising the entire baseline. Okay, next question. Oh, this is a nice one. What you're doing is fantastic. That is a comment from the crowd, which is great. They are fantastic. But advisory. Any thoughts on enforcement of standards?
Great. So yeah. I'll point to the National Cybersecurity Strategy, which talks about the responsibility for open source security ultimately falling on the users. So not so much the developers, who again are doing a great service to the world really by putting out their code for anyone to use and learn from, but the companies that are profiting from these open source packages. So really that's something we want to continue to ensure takes place, that we don't put any kind of barriers really on the publication side of open source software. Again, this enables tremendous innovation. We want to be taking a secure by design approach to the use of open source software.
And I'll echo outside the US, last year, Europe went through a very lengthy process passing some regulation called the Cyber Resiliency Act that does, in its final form, create an exception for open source stewards, right? Putting the burden on commercial entities while also setting aside this community-driven, volunteer-driven process that's so essential with a very light touch. So I think that's a fantastic effort that Europe has done, very much in line with our goals for secure by design and putting the burden on those entities that can shoulder it, big companies.
Excellent. How can CISA help open source users protect their environment?
Broad question, because their environment could mean all kinds of things, from the package repository down to my laptop. Not sure.
And in terms of the kind of companies using open source software, that's an area where we're thinking about closely. And we have, I'm not sure if people can see, but these great stickers we created. That's really one of the key takeaways. We did a request for information with the White House Office of the National Cyber Director and several other government agencies back in August of last year, got over 100 substantive responses to that. One of the key themes that we saw enough and saw so much that we made great stickers of this is that of responsible consumption and sustainable contribution. So really, we think everyone using open source software, whether a private company, whether a federal agency, needs to be thinking along these lines. One, around how are you vetting the open source software you're using as you would any other code that you package into your product and use. So are you looking at kind of its security posture? Are you making sure that you understand the full provenance of the open source software, maybe even through an SBOM, for instance? Actions like that, in addition to contributing back to help sustain that open source software.
And we did publish with the Enduring Software Framework last December a set of guidelines for commercial entities that are using open source to help keep their environments secure. And that includes, in addition to what Jack touched on, also using a staging environment to have a sort of separate area where that company can scan, review, approve all the open source they're bringing inside their firewall or into their product build pipelines.
Before it hits.
Yeah, I mean, you shouldn't just be installing open source right off the internet into a product that you're selling, just like you wouldn't pick up a hot dog you found on the sidewalk without, looking a little more closely at it.
That is not advisable.
It's no.
Hot dog on the sidewalk.
Not sure I'd eat that even if I looked at it a little closely. But.
I mean, yes, I
don't just grab any open source off Slashdot.
Sidewalk hot dogs, avoid them. And I'm sure that Alan really appreciates that SBOM name check in there. Okay, last question, due to time. We could go on. You just went on for 2 days, and I will ask you what your favorite part of it was. But can you provide examples of successful implementations of open source software in federal government projects?
Gosh, NASA has so many. One of our stickers, I don't think it's on these water bottles, is the latest Mars rover running Linux on it. A decade ago, NASA needed to automate a bunch of computers. They built the precursor to OpenStack, a huge open source project for cloud automation. There are so many.
And I'll flag too, CISA has our own open source repositories that you can go check out. We put out a lot of the code that we write for our own scanning tools, and something that more broadly the federal government has actually gotten pretty good at publishing its own open source code. There was a kind of federal memorandum back in 2016 directing federal agencies to do so. We're looking to now see how the federal government can also really increase our efforts to contribute back to the open source software that we use. That is, again, critical to really helping secure this ecosystem.
That's outstanding. And great examples, because NASA's pretty cool. And so is CISA.
Space is cool, but
space is cool.
CISA's almost as cool.
Space is, as long as they're not serving. I can't get over the sidewalk hot dog. I'm sorry. I keep coming back. I hope you didn't serve that at the summit.
No sidewalk hot dogs were served to our guests.
Okay, actually, there's one more question because Greg liked this one, and Greg is, helping us with the questions. Where do you see the biggest challenges over the next 2 years? So we talked about where do you see
Yeah.
CISA's work going? But externally, what do you see as the biggest challenges over the next 2 years?
A number of the attendees yesterday highlighted how they have seen, as the operators of this critical infrastructure in the open source supply chain, a nonlinear growth in demands on their services. So maybe not fully exponential, but definitely above linear. Their hosting costs and their staffing needs to support the security and the ongoing operation of these really important components, it's growing faster than their funding. And these are either groups that are mostly receiving just donations, right? Shoestring budgets, really critical work that supports our goals for memory safety, our goals for secure by design, and all of our US and global economies. And yet the demands on that are growing far faster than donations. We've got to find a way to keep that balance sustainable so that it can be secure.
Yep, I think it's something that we've taken for granted, but we cannot continue to do that. And we need to make sure that we're playing an active part in ensuring that this global ecosystem we rely upon is reliable, is secure for the years to come.
And that's why I think the work that you both are doing is so important. So thank you. Okay, that's the end of the questions. However, I have 2 questions for you both. First, what was your favorite part of the summit? What was your favorite presentation or the tabletop exercise? What was your favorite part?
Yeah, I'll say the tabletop exercise. I think that really was an inflection point in the summit for many. We'll admit there were some who expressed some skepticism coming into this, whether they get value out of it. But what we heard universally from the attendees was that they found this exercise to be extremely valuable. And shout out to the CISA team who runs these, because I think it exposed kind of many of the hard truths that can only be found by getting into a room and thinking about, okay, let's play out our kind of incident response processes in real time. Who's our kind of security point of contact? Some of these hard questions that really we saw many of the community members start to have kind of aha moments and figure out where they can improve.
And for me, it was also the tabletop exercise, but maybe from a bit of a different angle. I got to be if you're familiar with Dungeons and Dragons or tabletop role-playing games, I got to be the evil dungeon master and build a scenario that scared all my players and defeated them, and learn from them as they struggled to overcome these challenges that I built for them into the scenario. Some of the attendees commented yesterday afternoon that they thought, wow, this was kind of realistic, but a little over the top. And just watching other participants check them and say, actually, no, this hypothetical that was in the exercise is based on this factual event 5 years ago. And this one based on this event 7 years ago. And the community together sort of clued in on all the breadcrumbs I'd left for them to realize, no, this is a real possibility that they need to rally to respond to. So that was good for me.
That sounds awesome. Final question. Favorite tech or cyber movie?
Hackers.
Okay.
I'd not seen any of the hacker movies until a few years ago. I like hackers. I'll say War Games up there as well.
That's a good one.
Solid movies.
I always love, and Director Easterly happens to be here watching this, but I didn't realize it until she said that her favorite hacker movie is Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Which thinking back, I thought that is exactly what he does. He hacks into the computer and changes the absences. So, thank you both. Any final thoughts for the audience? Anything? We've really kind of dug into a pretty technical topic that I think you both really brought to life in terms of making it make sense for someone like me and hopefully the LinkedIn audience as well. But any final thoughts?
I'll just add, check us out at CISA.gov/OSS.
Oh, you're so good.
Contact us at opensource@CISA.dhs.gov. We'd love to hear from you, see how we can work with you and further drive this goal of safer open source software.
That's excellent.
I'll leave it there.
That's great.
That's great.
So good. Thanks for ending on the website. And reach out anytime if you have questions. We're here to help, and have a great week.
Thank you, Erin.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.